At 82 years old, Bill Gaither said something nobody in gospel music expected him to say publicly. And the name he put forward, one singer, one voice, one departure he has carried for 30 years, changes how you understand everything he built. To feel the weight of what Bill admitted, you have to understand what the man actually constructed across his lifetime. Bill Gaither didn't simply write Christian songs. He wrote the words that people reached for when their own ran out, the phrases whispered in hospital rooms and sung at gravesites when nothing else came close to fitting. He touched me. Because he lives. The king is coming. These weren't radio placements. They were the vocabulary of an entire generation's faith. And that's when the homecoming story started, in 1991, inside a gymnasium in Alexandria, Indiana, with a small group of friends and one camera and no plan for what it would become. What came out of that room grew into hundreds of videos watched by tens of millions of people, one of the longest-running and most loved ministries in the history of Christian music. Bill sat at the piano at the center of it all, year after year, gathering voices that carried something beyond technique, something that pointed audiences back toward the songs that mattered most. Mark Lowry could make a crowd laugh and then break completely open before they'd processed the shift. Guy Penrod carried a rugged reverence that hit people in the chest before their minds caught up. David Phelps brought what many still consider the most technically extraordinary tenor voice gospel music had ever produced. But none of them did what Michael English did to a room. When Michael sang in that Alexandria gymnasium, people who hadn't cried in years found themselves in tears. And not from sadness, but from recognition, from the feeling of hearing something completely true, delivered straight into a place they didn't know was waiting. Bill recognized that gift immediately. He said so more than once in those early years. And what he gave Michael inside the Gaither Vocal Band wasn't just a slot in an arrangement, but genuine creative space to be exactly who he was as a singer, a full expressionist, a man who could take a lyric the audience had heard 100 times and make it feel in that specific moment as though nobody had ever touched it before. 6 Dove Awards in a single year arrived in 1993, which by any measure in Christian music borders on the impossible. And a solo career was rising fast alongside his work with the Gaither family, while Nashville producers began paying serious attention to what that voice could do in a wider market. From the outside, Michael English's position at the center of that ministry looked like the most secure place a gospel artist could occupy. None of that mattered, because 1994 brought everything down at once. A public moral failure, painful and widely covered, led Michael to step away from Christian music entirely. The Dove Awards went back. Every stage went dark. That voice that had stopped people cold in living rooms across America fell completely silent, and the gospel community felt the absence in ways that lasted for years. What most people know is the fall itself. But here's the thing that far fewer people have focused on: what Bill Gaither chose to do in the aftermath, and what he chose to say about his own role 30 years later. Bill never pulled the early homecoming videos. Michael's voice kept circulating, kept reaching people, and that one quiet decision communicated something no formal statement could have matched. When Michael's name came up in interviews across those years, Bill spoke about him with what could only be described as a father's grief. Not the disappointment of someone whose employee failed to meet expectations, but the grief of someone who loved a person and watched them go through something devastating without knowing how to reach them across the distance it opened. A recent conversation, reflective in tone and never intended to travel the way it did, put a direct question to Bill. Had any singer in the full history of the Gaither Vocal Band left before the gospel world was finished hearing everything that voice had to offer? Bill said Michael English's name without hesitation, the way a person speaks a name they have turned over quietly for a very long time. What came next is the part that stayed with everyone in that room. Bill described Michael's gift using a phrase he had clearly chosen with care, calling it inhabited singing, the ability to be so completely present inside a lyric that the listener bypasses the analytical mind entirely and gets reached in the place where faith actually lives. That quality, Bill told them, had never appeared in quite the same form in any other singer, before or since. And then he said the rest of it. Bill said he regrets not doing more, not working harder in those critical months of 1994 to build a path that let Michael step back rather than step away entirely. The gospel community, and here he placed himself inside that group directly, without any deflection, wasn't equipped to hold space for someone in that kind of crisis, in the way the songs they sang every night demanded they should be, in the way the grace they preached required of them when it actually got tested. No blame was distributed. Michael's choices belonged to Michael, and Bill never suggested otherwise. What he offered instead was simpler and harder than blame. An older man looking back across a long life and finding the gap between what he believed and how he acted, when belief carried a real cost. The voice that stopped everyone cold in that gymnasium deserved a community around it, as gracious as the music it sang. And that's what Bill said plainly at 82, carrying that weight for the first time in public. Michael English did find his way back to recording, performing, and speaking with a candor about the hard years that functions as ministry in its own right. The quality Bill named, that fullness of presence that made audiences feel not just moved, but genuinely seen, still comes through when he performs today. And he has spoken about Bill Gaither with a love and gratitude that couldn't be manufactured. Russ Taff's story runs along the same thread, one of the most powerful voices in the broader Gaither family, a man who spent years fighting alcoholism largely out of sight, terrified of what the gospel community's response would be when the truth came out. Bill's relationship with Russ across those years, and since, reflects the same instinct that runs through every word he spoke about Michael English, a refusal to write people out of the story when the story gets difficult, a conviction grounded not just in theology, but in personal belief that the people who sing about grace carry an obligation to practice it in the places where practicing it actually costs something. Holding that position inside a public ministry isn't easy, and the tension between grace and accountability is one every community of faith works out in real time, without a clean answer that holds across every situation. What Bill's reflection gives people isn't a policy or a prescription, but an honest man looking back and saying that with that particular gift, in that particular moment, he wishes he had stayed longer in the difficulty and created more room for grace to actually work. There is a difference between welcoming the prodigal back after he has already made his own way home and going out to find him before he has to make that walk alone, and that distinction is exactly where Bill was pointing. For everyone who sat in a living room in 1991 and felt something shift when Michael English closed his eyes in that gymnasium and sang as though nothing else in the world existed, you already know what Bill means because you felt it before you had words for it. The man who recognized that gift first and gave it the largest possible stage is telling you, 30 years later, that he knows what you felt, and that he has never stopped caring about what happened to that voice and the man who carried it. Southern gospel, Christian music, worship, and the long arc of the homecoming story are all still being written, and Bill Gaither at 82 is still at the piano, still pointing people toward songs that matter, still building something that will outlast him. Drop a comment below about what Michael English's voice meant to you. Not about the controversy, not about the fall, but about what you heard in a season when you needed exactly what he was carrying. Bill has been listening to those voices for 8 decades, and if his honesty tells us anything, it's that he believes you deserve the full story, told with the same grace that runs through every song he ever wrote.